wherever the ever-wavering and unsteady mind goes, restraining or withdrawing it from there, one should subdue it by always keeping it firmly fixed, only in Atman, one's own real self. The key words used here are Atma Samstam Mana Kritva, which literally mean having made the mind stand firm or still in self, and by clear implication, they should be applied to each of the 3 sentences in these 2 verses. That is, we should gently and gradually withdraw our mind from all activity or thinking by making it stand firmly and motionless in our essential self. Having thus made it stand firm and motionless in our essential self, we should refrain from thinking of anything whatsoever. And if due to our lack of vigilance, it again wanders towards anything else, by making it stand firm once again in our essential self, we should restrain its wanderings, withdrawing it from whatever it is thinking of, and thereby subduing it and making it subside in our essential self. What exactly does Sri Krishna mean when he says that we should make our mind stand firm in self or Atman? The word samsta is the word sta, which literally means standing, qualified by the prefix sam, which literally means with or together with, but which is used to express not only conjunction or union, but also intensity, completeness, or thoroughness. Thus, samscha means standing with, standing united with, standing firm, standing still, standing fixed, or simply firmly abiding, remaining or being. Hence the words Atma Samsta Mana denotes the state in which our mind is firmly and motionlessly established in our essential being as our essential being, having consciously subsided and thereby merged, united, and become one with it. Therefore, what Sri Krishna clearly implies by these words is that we should keep our entire mind or attention firmly fixed or keenly focused upon our real self or essential being, and should thereby remain firmly in the state of our clear self-attentive being. However, until our vasanas, or latent desires, are greatly weakened, our mind will continue to be wavering and unsteady, and will therefore repeatedly rush out towards things other than ourself. When our mind is in such a condition, we cannot force it against its will to remain quietly and peacefully in our natural state of self-attentive being. And therefore, by repeatedly practicing this art of being steadfastly self-attentive, we must gently and gradually train it and cultivate in it the willingness to withdraw from its habitual activity of thinking of things other than itself. The words in verse 25 that I have translated as gently and gradually are sanai, sanai. This repetition of the word sanai, which is an adverb meaning quietly, calmly, softly, gently, or gradually, conveys the sense that this practice of withdrawing from all activity by establishing our mind firmly in our own being should be done not only gently and without any force or compulsion, but also repeatedly and persistently. This same sense is also conveyed in the next verse. That is, whenever and wherever our mind may wander, we should persistently practice restraining it, withdrawing it each time from the objects it is thinking about, and subduing it by establishing it firmly in our own essential being. Whenever we succeed in our efforts to establish our mind thus in our real self or Atman, we should remain firmly established in that state of self-attentive being without thinking even the least about any other things. By practicing this art of repeatedly drawing our mind or attention back from thoughts towards ourself, we will gradually weaken and eventually destroy all our deeply rooted vasanas or desires. This process of destroying our vasanas as soon as they rise in the form of thoughts is described by Sri Ramana in more detail in the 10th and 11th paragraphs of Nanyar. In the 10th paragraph he says, even though Vishaya vasanas are latent impulsions or desires to attend to things other than ourselves, which come from time immemorial, rise as thoughts in countless numbers like ocean waves, they will all be destroyed when Svarupa Dhyana, self-attentiveness, increases and increases. Without giving room to the doubting thought, is it possible to dissolve so many vasanas and be or remain only as self? We should cling tenaciously to self-attentiveness. However great a sinner a person may be, if instead of lamenting and weeping, I am a sinner, how am I going to be saved? He completely rejects the thought that he is a sinner and is zealous or steadfast in self-attentiveness, he will certainly be reformed or transformed into the true form of thought-free self-conscious being. Our vasanas or latent desires, which are the driving forces that impel us to think, and our thoughts, which are their manifest forms, do not have any power of their own. They derive their power only from us. So long as we attend to them, we are feeding them with the power that is inherent in our attention. As Sri Sadhu Om used to say, our attention is the divine power of grace, because it is in essence the supreme Chit Shakti or power of consciousness, which is our essential being and the absolute reality. Our attention or consciousness is the power that underlies, supports, and gives life to our imagination, and as such it is the power that creates this entire world of duality and multiplicity. Therefore, whatever we attend to is nourished and made seemingly real. Our desires and thoughts appear to be real only because we attend to them, and hence the power they seem to have is derived only from our attention. Just as our experience of a dream appears to be real and to have power over us only so long as we attend to it, so all our desires and thoughts appear to be real and to have power over us only so long as we attend to them. Therefore, if we fix our attention entirely and exclusively in our own essential being, and thereby ignore all the thoughts that our vasanas or latent desires impel to rise, we will deprive those latent desires of the power which they need to survive, and which they can obtain only from our attention. The more we thus deprive them of the attention they seek, the weaker they will become, and thus we will gain increasing power to resist the power of attraction with which they have until now been dominating us. This is the reason why Sri Ramana said in the 6th paragraph of Nanyar, when we practice and practice in this manner, to our mind the power to stand firmly established in its birthplace will increase. That is, the more we practice this art of being vigilantly self-attentive, steadfastly ignoring all our impulses or desires to think of anything else, the more we will gain the strength to remain firmly established in our own naturally and ever clearly self-conscious being. When our strength or power to remain firmly established in our self-conscious being thus increases, all our latent desires or vasanas will be progressively weakened and will eventually lose the power that they now have to distract us away from our natural state of just being. This is the reason why Sri Ramana says that they will all be destroyed when Svarupa Dhyana, self-attentiveness, increases and increases, and why he says that we should therefore give no room to the rising of any type of thought, but should instead cling tenaciously to self-attentiveness. Whatever thought we may feel impelled to think, by clinging tenaciously to self-attentiveness, we can then and there weaken not only that particular impulsion or vasana, but also simultaneously all our latent impulsions to think any thoughts and with continued tenacity, we can eventually destroy completely all our latent impulsions or desires. Therefore, if we truly wish to destroy all our latent desires and thereby attain our natural state of true self-knowledge, we must be extremely tenacious and persistent in our practice of self-attentiveness, which is the true art of being. What in practice does Sri Ramana mean by the words without giving room to the doubting thought whether it is possible to dissolve so many vasanas and be only as self? We should cling tenaciously to Svarupa Dhyana, self-attentiveness. And when he says in the 13th paragraph, without giving even the slightest room to the rising of any thought except Atma Chintana, the thought of self, being completely absorbed in Atmanishta, self-abidance, is giving ourself to God. Not giving room to the rising of any other thoughts means ignoring them completely, not allowing them even the slightest space within the field of our attention or consciousness. But how in practice is it possible for us to exclude all thoughts from our consciousness? It is possible for us to do so only by filling our attention or consciousness wholly and exclusively with the thought of self, Svarupa Dhyana or Atma Chintana, that is, with clear, keen, and vigilant self-attentiveness. Though Sri Ramana sometimes referred to self-attentiveness as the thought of self, using words that imply thinking such as dhyana or chintana, he often clarified that it is actually a state of just being, and not a state of thinking or mental activity. Therefore, since paying attention to anything other than ourself is thinking, and since being attentive only to ourself is a state not of thinking, but of just being, self-attentiveness is the only practical and effective means by which we can exclude all thoughts from our consciousness. In the last sentence of this paragraph, Sri Ramana assures us that if we are zealous or steadfast in self-attentiveness, we will certainly be reformed or transformed. The word that I have translated as zealous or steadfast is ukam ulavan, which means a person who has ukam, impulse, ardor, zeal, strength, firm conviction, and sincerity. Thus, in this context, the word ukam implies the same ardent tenacity and steadfastness that is emphasized by the words vidapidiyai, pidika vendum, which occur earlier in this paragraph and which I translated as should cling tenaciously to. Clinging fast to self-attentiveness with such ardent tenacity, zeal, steadfastness, and perseverance is essential if we truly wish to succeed in our efforts to obtain absolute happiness, which can be experienced only in the calm and thought-free state of true self-knowledge. The final word of this paragraph is urupaduvan, which etymologically means will become form, but which is commonly used in an idiomatic sense to mean will be elevated or improved in body, mind, or morals, and hence I have translated it as will be reformed or will be transformed. However, since the word uru or form can also denote svarupa, our own form or essential self, in this context the meaning implied by urupaduvan is not merely that we will become morally reformed or will be transformed into a better person, but is that we will be transformed into our own true and eternal form, which is thought-free, infinite, all-transcending, absolute, and perfectly clear self-conscious being. In the 11th paragraph of Nanyar, Sri Ramana goes on to explain more about how the practice of self-attentive being enables us to destroy all our vasanas or latent desires to experience things other than ourself. As long as Vishaya vasanas, latent impulsions or desires to attend to anything other than ourself, exist in our mind, so long the investigation who am I is necessary. as and when thoughts arise, then, and there it is necessary for us to annihilate them all by investigation, keen and vigilant self-attentiveness in the very place from which they arise. Being, abiding, or remaining without attending to anything other than ourself is vairagya, dispassion, or nirasa, desirelessness. Being, abiding, or remaining without leaving, separating from, or letting go of our real self is jnana, knowledge. In truth, these two, desirelessness and true knowledge, are only one. Just as a pearl diver, tying a stone to his waist and submerging, picks up a pearl which lies in the ocean, so each person, submerging beneath the surface activity of their mind and sinking deep within themselves with vairagya, freedom from desire or passion for anything other than being, can attain the pearl of self. If one clings fast to uninterrupted svarupa smarana, self-remembrance, until one attains svarupa, one's own essential self, that alone will be sufficient. So long as enemies are within the fort, they will continue coming out from it. If we continue destroying or cutting down all of them as and when they come, the fort will eventually come into our possession. The investigation or vichara, who am I, that Sri Ramana refers to here, is the same practice of self-attentiveness that he referred to in the previous paragraph as svarupa dhyana, or meditation upon one's own essential form. Since this practice of self-attentive being is the only means by which we can effectively weaken and eventually destroy all our vasanas or latent desires, it is necessary for us to continue practicing it tenaciously until all of them have been thoroughly eradicated. Since these latent desires are the driving forces that impel us to think, as long as any thought, any trace of a knowledge of anything other than our mere self-conscious being I am appears in our consciousness, so long should we tenaciously persevere in clinging to keen and vigilant self-attentiveness. So long as we continue to be vigilantly self-attentive, we will be effectively annihilating each thought that attempts to rise, because our keen self-attentiveness will give no room for any thoughts to rise, as and when any latent desire attempts to rise in the form of a thought, it will be immediately annihilated at the very moment and place in which it thus attempts to rise. The place or source in which and from which all our thoughts arise is our own essential being or consciousness I am. By self-attentiveness we remain in and as our self-conscious being, and thus we cut down each thought then and there as soon as it begins to rise. If, however, our self-vigilance slackens even an iota, we will thereby give room to the rising of thoughts, and hence they will rush forth in great numbers in an attempt to distract our attention further away from our being. If we are attracted by these thoughts and therefore fail to regain our self-attentiveness immediately, they will continue to rise with great vigor and will thereby overpower us, subjecting us once again to the delusion of duality. This self-negligence, self-forgetfulness, or slackness in our natural self-attentiveness is named in Vedanta philosophy as pramada, since it enables our power of maya, or self-delusion, to overpower us with the manifold products of our imagination, beginning with our illusory individuality and including all our desires, our thoughts, and the objects of this world. Since ancient times, sages have repeatedly affirmed the truth that such self-negligence, or pramada, is death. That is, when due to our self-negligence, we slip down from our firm self-attentive abidance as being, we seemingly transform ourselves into the finite and unreal individual consciousness that we call our mind, and we thereby in effect die to our infinite real self. When we succeed in our attempt to cling tenaciously to self-attentiveness, we will thereby avoid attending to any other thing, or in other words, we will avoid imagining or thinking of any other thing than ourself. Since the forces that impel us to imagine and know things other than ourselves are our latent desires, we will be able to refrain from attending to any other thing only when we are able to avoid the fatal error of succumbing to the delusive attraction of the imaginary objects of our desires. Therefore, whenever we remain without attending to anything other than ourselves, we are at that moment remaining free from all our desires, and hence Sri Ramana says, being without attending to anything other than ourselves is vairagya, dispassion, or nirasa, desirelessness. In this state of self-attentive being, in which all our imaginary knowledge of other things is entirely excluded, all that we know is our own non-dual consciousness of being I am. Since, as we have seen in earlier chapters, this non-dual self-consciousness I am is the only true knowledge, because it is the only knowledge that is not finite or relative. Sri Ramana says, being without leaving our real self, our own essential self-conscious being I am, is jnana, knowledge. That is, whenever we are able to be without leaving our firm and attentive hold on our clear, natural, and eternal self-conscious being I am, we are at that moment experiencing only the one, true, infinite, and absolute knowledge. Since not attending to anything other than ourself and not leaving ourself are just two alternate ways of describing our natural state of thought-free self-attentive being, after defining desirelessness as being without attending to anything other than ourself, and true knowledge as being without leaving ourself, Sri Ramana concludes by saying, in truth, these two are only one. That is, the only state of true desirelessness is the state of true self-knowledge. Since this state is not something alien to us, but is our own natural and eternal state of being, we can begin to experience it even now by simply remaining vigilantly and firmly as our mere self-attentive being. Because we always know I am, our consciousness of our own being is always present. However, because of our desire to pay attention to the thoughts and objects that we have created by our self-deceptive power of imagination, we tend to ignore or overlook this fundamental self-consciousness. The more strongly our desires impel our mind or attention to flow out towards the objects of our imagination, the more will we tend to overlook our own essential self-conscious being. In other words, the stronger our desires become, the more dense our self-ignorance will grow. Conversely, the weaker our desires become, the more brightly and clearly our natural self-consciousness or self-knowledge will shine. In other words, the degree of our clarity of self-consciousness is inversely proportional to the strength of our desires and the consequent density of our thoughts or mental activities. Therefore, self-consciousness, or self-attentiveness, as we call it when we practice it as a spiritual exercise, is not something that is either white or black. That is, it is not a quality that is either present or absent, but is one that is always present, but in widely varying degrees of clarity or intensity. This is true, of course, only from the standpoint of our mind, which, being an extroverted form of attention or consciousness, never experiences its own essential consciousness of being with perfect and absolute clarity. From the standpoint of our real self, which is itself the absolute clarity of our consciousness of being, there are no relative degrees of self-consciousness, because its natural and infinite consciousness of its own being alone truly exists. However, though the absolute truth is that our self-consciousness alone really exists, and that there is therefore no other thing that could ever obscure or diminish its intense and perfect clarity, in the relative and dualistic outlook of our mind, self-consciousness appears to be something that we experience with varying degrees of clarity and intensity. From the standpoint of our spiritual practice, therefore, our aim should always be to experience our self-consciousness or self-attentiveness with the greatest possible degree of clarity. Hence, we should try to focus our attention so keenly on our own self-conscious being that all our awareness or knowledge of any other thing is entirely excluded. The more we are able by such keen self-attentiveness to exclude all other knowledge or thoughts, the more clearly and intensely we will become conscious of ourself as we really are. In order to illustrate this process by which we can make our self-consciousness become increasingly clear and intense, Sri Ramana gives us the analogy of a pearl diver who sinks deep into the ocean to collect a pearl. Our thoughts, which are the imaginary knowledge that we have of things other than ourselves, are like the ever-restless waves on the surface of the ocean. The closer we are to the surface of our mind, the more we will be buffeted about by the movement of our thoughts. However, instead of floating about near the surface, if we sink, dive, or penetrate deep into our being, we will increasingly approach the absolute core and essence of our being, which is entirely free of all such movement. The deeper we sink into our being, the less we will be affected by the movement of any thought. Sinking or diving deep into ourself, therefore, means penetrating deep beneath the surface activity of our mind by focusing our attention ever more keenly, pointedly, exclusively, and firmly upon our emness, our fundamental consciousness of our own essential being, which we always experience as I am. When our attention penetrates thus into the very essence of our being, our mind will subside or sink into the state of just being, and thus all its activity or thinking will automatically and effortlessly cease. Only by repeatedly and persistently penetrating thus into the depth of our own emness, our essential self-conscious being, will we eventually be able to reach its innermost depth or absolute core, which is itself the pearl of self, the perfect state of true and infinitely clear self-knowledge which we are seeking to attain. Sri Ramana often used this analogy of diving or sinking into water to illustrate how deeply and intensely our attention should penetrate into the innermost core or essence of our being. For example, in verse 28 of Uladu Narpadu, he says, like sinking, immersing, or diving, in order to find an object that has fallen into water, diving, sinking, immersing, piercing, or penetrating within ourselves, restraining our speech and breath by means of a sharp intellect, a keen, intense, acute, and penetrating power of discernment or attention, we should know the place or source where our rising ego rises. Know this. The key words in this verse are kurda matiyal, which means by a sharp, pointed, keen, intense, acute, and penetrating mind, intellect, or power of discernment, cognition, or attention. And they are placed in this verse in such a position that they apply by implication to all the verbs that follow them. That is, we should restrain our speech and breath by a keenly focused and penetrating intellect. We should dive or sink within ourselves by a keenly focused and penetrating intellect, and we should know the source from which our ego rises by a keenly focused and penetrating intellect. But what exactly does Sri Ramana mean in this context by these words kurunda mati, a sharp, pointed, keenly focused and penetrated mind or intellect? The clue he gives us to answer this question lies in the last two verbs that they qualify. That is, since this keen and penetrating intellect is the means or instrument by which we can dive, sink, immerse, or pierce deep within ourselves, and by which we can thus know the source from which our ego rises, it must be an intellect, a power of discernment or attention that is turned inwards and focused keenly, pointedly, and penetratingly upon our real self or essential being, which is the source or place from which our ego or individual sense of I rises. Therefore, a kurunda mati is a keenly, sharply, intensely, and penetratingly self-attentive intellect. In this context, it is important to note that though the Sanskrit words buddhi and mati are usually translated in English by the word intellect, they do not merely mean intellect in the superficial sense in which this word is normally used in English. That is, in the English word intellect is normally understood to mean just our superficial power of reasoning or rational thought, whereas in Sanskrit, Tamil, and other Indian languages, the words buddhi and mati convey a much deeper meaning than this. The real meaning of these words, particularly in the sense in which Sri Ramana uses the word mati in this verse, is intellect in its original sense, which is derived from the Latin words interlegere, meaning to choose between, and which therefore denotes our power or faculty of discernment or discrimination. Therefore, in this verse, the word mati denotes our deep inner power of discernment, or ability to distinguish and clearly recognize that which is real. A power that is derived not just from intellectual reasoning or rational thought, but rather from the profound natural clarity of pure self-consciousness, which always exists within us, but which is usually clouded over by the density and intensity of our desires and attachments and our resulting thoughts. Though in the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, the two words manas or mind and buddhi or intellect are often used in such a way as they appear to denote two different entities, Sri Ramana clarified the fact that they are not actually two different entities, but are just two different aspects or functions of one single entity, namely our finite individual consciousness, which we usually refer to as our mind. Therefore, whenever a distinction is implied in the meaning of these two words, the word manas or mind denotes our mind in its more superficial and dynamic function as a power of thinking, feeling, and perceiving, whereas the word buddhi or intellect denotes our mind in its deeper and more static function as a calm power of inner clarity, discernment, discrimination, or true understanding. Hence, the word mati, which is used in this verse as an equivalent of the form buddhi, means our mind, but rather than just our mind in a vague or general sense, it more specifically means our mind as a power of inner clarity and discernment, a power of attention that is capable of turning itself away from all appearances and focusing itself keenly and clearly upon the one reality that underlies them, namely, our own essential self-consciousness I am. Since our mind is a separate individual consciousness that deserves this name mind only so long as it attends to anything other than its own essential being, and since it subsides and becomes one with our being when it attends to it truly, wholly and exclusively, the keenly self-attentive mind that is denoted by these words, kurunda mati, actually ceases to be an individual mind or ego as soon as it becomes truly self-attentive and thereby submerges and sinks into the depth of our being, and thus it is transformed by its self-attentiveness into our real self, of which it is now wholly conscious. In other words, a truly kurunda or keenly self-attentive mind is actually nothing other than our naturally and eternally self-conscious being. Though Sri Ramana mentions restraining our speech and breath in association with diving, sinking, immersing, or piercing within, it is not actually necessary for us to make any special effort to restrain either our speech or our breath, Because just as our thoughts or mental activities will all subside automatically and effortlessly when we become intensely self-attentive, so too will our speech and breath. Therefore, if we undertake this simple and direct practice of self-attentive being from the very outset, there will never be any need for us to practice any of the artificial exercises of pranayama or breath restraint, because by our mere self-attentiveness, we will naturally restrain and bring to a complete standstill all the activity of our mind, speech, breath, and body. Since all these activities are merely imaginations that arise only when we allow our attention to leak out towards anything other than ourself, they will all disappear and become non-existent as soon as we effectively draw our entire attention back into the innermost depth or core of our being, which is the source from which it arises and flows outwards as our mind, intellect, or ego. Though the word mati is used in Tamil in the sense of mind, intellect, understanding, discrimination, or discernment, it is actually a word of Sanskrit origin. And in Sanskrit, besides these meanings, it can also mean intention, resolution, will, desire, or devotion. If we understand the words kurunda, matiyal in this latter sense, they would mean by intense devotional love. Though this is not the principal meaning of these words in this context, it is nevertheless appropriate as a secondary meaning, because we will be able to sink or penetrate deep within ourselves only if we have great love for the state of just being, which is the true form of God. Unless we truly have intense love for being, we will be unwilling to surrender ourselves to it, and hence our mind, together with all its vasanas or latent desires, will continue to rise in rebellion whenever we try to cling firmly to self-attentiveness and thereby to sink deep into our innermost being. Devotion and desirelessness, that is, true love for being and freedom from desire for anything other than being, are like the two inseparable sides of a single piece of paper, and they each increase in direct proportion to the increase of the other. Therefore, when Sri Ramana compares vairagya, or freedom from desire, to the stone that a pearl diver ties to his waist, saying that by submerging beneath the surface activity of our mind and sinking deep within ourselves with vairagya, we can attain the pearl of self, he implies that in order to be able to sink to the innermost depth of our being, we require not only vairagya, but also great love, or bhakti. Devotion and desirelessness, or bhakti and vairagya, as they are respectively called in Sanskrit and other Indian languages, are not only inseparable, but are actually just two different ways of describing the same state of mind. However, they are usually spoken of as two separate entities, because they are each a particular aspect of that one state of mind. Because they are both indispensable qualities that we require in order to be able to attain true self-knowledge, they are sometimes said to be the two things by which we must learn to fly to the transcendent state of absolute being. Both devotion and desirelessness arise due to another essential quality which is called viveka, a Sanskrit word that means discrimination, discernment, or the ability to distinguish the real from the unreal, the eternal from the ephemeral, the substance from the form, or the actual truth from what merely appears to be true. True viveka is not merely an intellectual understanding of the truth, but is a deep inner clarity that exists naturally in the core of our being, and that arises in our mind when it becomes purified or cleansed of the grosser forms of its desires. An intellectual understanding of the truth is a useful starting point from which we can commence our inward search for the actual experience of true knowledge. But it will blossom into true discrimination or viveka only if we apply it in practice by actually turning our mind inwards to discover the true nature of our essential being. To the extent that our mind is purified of its desires, to that extent will the clarity of true discrimination or viveka arise within it. Conversely, the more clearly we are able to discriminate, understand, and be truly convinced that happiness exists only within ourselves and not in any other thing, the stronger will both our devotion and desirelessness become. Thus, true discrimination, or viveka, enkindles in our mind true devotion or bhakti and true desirelessness or vairagya. And true devotion and desirelessness clarify our mind, thereby increasing our power of discrimination. The most potent and effective means by which we can enkindle the clarity of true discrimination in our mind is to be constantly and deeply self-attentive, because when we are self-attentive, we are focusing our attention on our consciousness of being, which is not only the light that illumines our mind, but is also the infinite fullness and source of all clarity, knowledge, or understanding. Or to explain the same thing in another way, when we are self-attentive, we are warding off all the thoughts that cloud and obscure the infinite clarity of being that always shines in our heart or innermost core. Thus, by self-attentiveness, we are opening our heart to the true grace of God, which is our natural clarity of perfect self-consciousness, and which by its pure light will enable us to discriminate, understand, and be truly and deeply convinced of the truth. If our understanding and discrimination does not give us sufficient strength of conviction to enable us to withdraw our mind easily from everything other than ourself, and to focus it intensely upon our essential being, it must only be a superficial and unclear form of discrimination or viveka. When our discrimination becomes truly deep, clear, and intense, that is when it becomes a truly kurunda mati or keenly penetrating power of discernment, it will shine within us as an unshakable strength of conviction, which we will experience as intense bhakti or love for our natural state of just being, and as firm vairagya or freedom from desire for anything other than being. And thus it will enable us to surrender our finite individual self, our mind or ego, and thereby sink effortlessly into the innermost depth of our essential being. Just as the weight of a stone enables a pearl diver to sink deep into the ocean, so the intensity of our bhakti and vairagya will enable us to sink deep into the innermost core of our being. However, until we actually cultivate sufficiently intense bhakti and vairagya, whenever we attempt to be vigilantly self-attentive, we will not be able to sink very deep, but will continue to float just below the surface of our mind, where our thoughts will continue to disturb us. That is, our self-attentiveness will not be very deep and clear, but will continue to be shallow and clouded by the thoughts that we constantly like to think, due to our lack of true vairagya or desirelessness. Our liking to think of anything other than ourself is the sole obstacle that prevents us from sinking deep into our real self-conscious being, and such a liking is caused by our lack of true discrimination or viveka. If we were truly convinced that happiness exists only within ourselves and not in any other thing, we would certainly gain the love to subside into the peaceful, thought-free depth of our own self-conscious being, and would therefore lose our desire to think of anything else. However, though we need this firm conviction which arises as a result of clear discrimination, in order to be able to remain firmly and deeply self-attentive, the only way to gain it is by practicing self-attentiveness. By repeatedly and persistently practicing the art of being self-attentive to whatever extent we can, we will gradually enkindle within our mind the necessary clarity of true discrimination or viveka, and thus we will cultivate a steadily increasing strength of true love or bhakti and true desirelessness or vairagya, which will in turn enable us to sink deeper into our naturally ever self-conscious being. Thus, the three inseparable qualities of viveka, bhakti, and vairagya, which Sri Ramana describes collectively as kurdamati, or a keenly penetrating power of discernment and love, will drive our mind deeper into our natural state of self-conscious or self-attentive being. And by sinking deep into this state, we will cultivate and increase these three qualities. Therefore, however weak or strong our present viveka, bhakti, and vairagya may be, the only way for us to progress from where we now stand towards our goal of attaining the infinitely happy experience of true self-knowledge is to attempt repeatedly and persistently to be ever self-attentive. After saying that in order to attain the pearl of self-knowledge, we should sink deep within ourselves with steadfast desirelessness, Sri Ramana goes on to say, if one clings fast to uninterrupted svarupa smarana, self-remembrance, until one attains svarupa, one's own essential being, or real self, that alone will be sufficient. Why exactly does he use the term svarupa smarana, or self-remembrance here? We never actually forget ourself, because we always know I am. However, though we are always conscious of our own being as I am, we tend to ignore or overlook it because we are so interested in attending to things other than ourselves, which are all mere products of our imagination. When our mind is thus constantly absorbed in thinking of things other than itself, it, in effect, forgets its own real self, its essential being, which does not think anything, but just is. Since all our thoughts or imaginations are thus constantly distracting our attention away from our natural consciousness of being, we can put an end to their distracting influence only by trying to remember our being uninterruptedly. Self-remembrance is therefore the antidote to our fascination with thinking of things other than ourself. However, because our desire to think of other things is so strong, when we try to cling fast to self-remembrance, our mind will rebel and rise in the form of innumerable thoughts, thereby interrupting our effort to remember only ourself. Whenever our self-remembrance is thus interrupted by the rising of other thoughts, we should again remember our being and thereby withdraw our attention from them. The more we practice remembering ourselves in this manner, the more we will gain the strength and ability to cling exclusively and uninterruptedly to our remembrance of our own simple self-conscious being. This practice or exercise of self-remembrance is not an attempt to regain the memory of something that we have forgotten, as for example we would try to remember where we had placed something that we had lost and are now trying to find, because our own self or essential being is always present and known by us, and is therefore something we have never really lost or forgotten. Rather, this practice is an attempt to retain the memory of something that we wish to avoid forgetting, as for example we would try to remember constantly a person or thing whose memory gives us great joy. Self-remembrance is therefore simply another name for self-attentiveness, that is, being constantly attentive, conscious, mindful, or aware of our own mere being or emness. Therefore, this term svarupa smarana, or self-remembrance, that Sri Ramana uses here in this 11th paragraph, the term svarupa dhyana, or self-meditation, that he used in the previous paragraph, the term atma-chintana, self-thinking, self-thought, self-consideration, or self-contemplation, that he uses in the 13th paragraph, and the term atma-vichara, self-investigation, self-examination, or self-scrutiny, that he uses in many other places, all denote the same simple practice of self-attentive being. As Sri Ramana says in the 16th paragraph of Nanyar, the name Atma Vichara is truly applicable only to the practice of always being, abiding or remaining, having put, placed, kept, seated, deposited, detained, fixed, or established our mind in Atma, our own real self. What exactly does Sri Ramana mean when he talks of putting, placing, keeping, or detaining our mind in Atma or our own real self? Our real self or essential being is the sole reality that underlies the appearance of our mind, and as such it is its source and natural abode. So long as we know nothing other than our own being, our mind remains naturally in and as our own infinite, undivided, and non-dual real self. When, however, we begin to imagine and know anything other than our own being, our mind seemingly comes out from our real self as a separate and finite individual consciousness, whose nature appears to be thinking, that is, constantly attending to those other things which it has created by its imagination. Hence, putting, placing, keeping, or detaining our mind in our real self means preventing it from rising and coming out as a separate thinking or object-knowing consciousness. Therefore, since our mind comes out from our real self only by attending to things other than itself, and since it remains in our real self whenever it attends to and knows only our own being, putting, placing, keeping, or detaining our mind in our real self means fixing or retaining our attention wholly and exclusively in our own essential self-conscious being, without allowing it to come out to know or experience any other thing. Thus, this simple definition given by Sri Ramana, which expresses perfectly the very essence of the practice called Atma Vichara or self-investigation, can be paraphrased by saying that Atma Vichara is a name that is applicable only to the practice of always being steadfastly self-attentive or conscious only of our own essential being, I am. Self-remembrance or self-attentiveness is a practice that we can train ourselves to maintain even while we are engaged in other activities. Whatever we may be doing by mind, speech, or body, we always know that we are. So by persistent practice, it is possible for us to gain the skill to maintain a tenuous current of self-attentiveness in the midst of all other activities. When we cultivate this skill to be always tenuously aware of our underlying self-consciousness throughout our waking and dream states, we will also become more clearly aware of our continuing self-consciousness in sleep. That is, by persistently practicing self-attentiveness or self-remembrance whenever our mind is free from any other work, we will gradually become so familiar with our natural and essential self-consciousness that we will continue to be tenuously aware of it even when our mind is engaged in activity and even when it has subsided in sleep. Though we cannot be wholly or deeply attentive to our being when our mind is engaged in activity, we can nevertheless be tenuously attentive to it at all times. This is the state that Sri Ramana describes as clinging fast to uninterrupted Svarupa Smarana or self-remembrance, and as always being or remaining, keeping our mind fixed in Atma or our own real self. And he says that practicing thus alone is sufficient. Why does he say that clinging fast to uninterrupted Svarupa Smarana or self-remembrance until we attain our own real self will alone be sufficient? Though in the initial stage of this practice, our self-remembrance will be frequently interrupted by the rising of thoughts and the consequent activity of our mind, and though in the more advanced stages of practice, it may not be entirely interrupted, but is nevertheless greatly diminished by whatever activity our mind may be engaged in, due to our persistence in this practice, our vasanas, or latent desires to think of things other than ourself will be steadily weakened, and thus we will gain the vairagya, or freedom from desire, that is required for us to be able to sink into the innermost depth of our being, where we can obtain the pearl of true self-knowledge. So long as we mistake ourself to be this physical body, we will feel impelled to engage in physical, vocal, and mental activities, if not at all times, at least at certain times, because such activity is necessary for the maintenance of our life in this body. Therefore, until we transcend this illusion that we are this body, we will not be able to remain completely untouched by the rising of thoughts. Hence, sinking or diving deep within ourself is a practice that we cannot be engaged in uninterruptedly at all times. However, though we cannot uninterruptedly and at all times be deeply, keenly, intensely, and clearly self-attentive until we actually attain the perfect experience of true and absolute self-knowledge, even during this stage of practice, we can strive to be uninterruptedly self-attentive, at least tenuously. By trying to maintain at least a tenuous degree of self-attentiveness at all times, we can steadily weaken our latent desires and thereby make it easier for ourselves to sink deep into our being at certain times, and by sometimes sinking deep into our being, we can gain an increased degree of clarity of self-consciousness, which will make it easier for us to maintain a tenuous but uninterrupted current of self-attentiveness, even in the midst of various activities. However, though attempting to maintain uninterruptedly a tenuous current of self-attentiveness in this manner is an important element of our spiritual practice, we cannot actually attain the true experience of absolute self-knowledge until we thereby gain sufficient viveka, bhakti, and vairagya to be able to sink into the innermost depth of our being, where the bright and infinite light of perfectly clear and absolute non-dual self-consciousness is eternally shining as I am. In the final two sentences of this 11th paragraph, Sri Ramana gives another analogy in order to illustrate what he had said in the first two sentences, namely, as long as Vishaya vasanas, latent desires for things other than ourself, exist in our mind, so long the investigation, who am I, is necessary. As and when thoughts arise, then and there it is necessary for us to annihilate them all by vichara, self-investigation or self-attentiveness, in the very place from which they arise. The analogy he gives to illustrate this process of annihilating all thoughts as soon as they arise is as follows. So long as enemies are within the fort, they will continue coming out from it. If we continue destroying or cutting down all of them as and when they come, the fort will eventually come into our possession. In this simile, the fort is our own real self, the core of our being, which is the source of our mind. And the enemies that reside within it are our vasanas, or latent desires for things other than our own being. In order to take possession of a fort, we must besiege it. And when we do so, the enemies inside will not just remain there peacefully and submissively. For their own survival, it is necessary for them to come out in an attempt to break our siege and replenish their food supply. The food supply that our latent desires require for their gratification and survival is the knowledge of things other than our being. So long as we feed our mind with the knowledge of otherness or duality, it will survive and flourish. But if we deprive it of such knowledge, it will grow weak, because in the absence of such knowledge, its separate identity or individuality will be dissolved. For its own survival, therefore, our mind will rise in rebellion as soon as we try to retain it in our mere being. That is, it will rebel by constantly trying to think of anything other than our own essential self-conscious being. Since thoughts can rise only when we attend to them. They can be destroyed at the very place and moment that they arise only by our clinging tenaciously to self-attentiveness. If we are steadfast in our self-attentiveness or self-remembrance, every thought that our mind tries to think will perish due to its being ignored by us. This ignoring of all thoughts by our clinging tenaciously to self-attentiveness is what Sri Ramana describes as cutting down all the enemies as and when they come out of the fort. Therefore, if we persist long enough in our practice of self-attentive being, all our vasanas or latent desires to think will eventually be destroyed, and our mind will thereby sink back into the source from which it arose. This eventual sinking of our mind, or attention back into our source or essential being, is what Sri Ramana describes by saying that the fort will eventually come into our possession. It is not necessary for us to continue struggling eternally to resist the attraction of things other than ourself, and thereby to remain in our mere being, because by struggling to do so for a while, we will be able to completely annihilate our desires, which makes those other things appear to be so attractive. Other things attract us because we wrongly believe that we can obtain happiness from them, and we believe this due to our lack of viveka, or true discrimination. However, by being constantly self-attentive, we will be feeding our mind with the natural clarity of viveka that exists within us as the clear light of our ever self-luminous consciousness of our own being, and thereby we will steadily gain an increasingly strong conviction that happiness lies only within ourselves and not in any other being. The stronger this conviction becomes, the more our bhakti or love for our own being and our vairagya or freedom from desire for anything other than our being will grow, and the easier it will therefore become for us to resist the false and delusive attraction of knowing anything other than being. Therefore, as a practice, self-attentiveness is necessary for us only until such a time as all our vasanas, or latent desires, are destroyed by the dawning of true self-knowledge, whereupon we will discover that self-attentiveness or self-consciousness is the very nature of our being, and is therefore something that truly does not require any effort or practice. When our mind and all its vasanas are thus destroyed by our experience of true self-knowledge, our false and imaginary individuality will be dissolved, and we will remain effortlessly and eternally as the infinite and absolute consciousness of just being I am. In this state of mano nasa, or complete annihilation of our mind, which is the state that is also known as nirvana, or total extinction of the illusion of our individual self, there is nothing further for us to do, and nothing other than our being for us to know. This is the true experience of Sri Ramana and all other sages, and it is clearly expressed by him in verse 15 of Upadesa Undiyar and verse 31 of Uladu Narpadu, when his mind form is annihilated. For the great yogi who is thereby established as the reality, there is not a single action or doing, because he has attained his own true nature, which is actionless being. For one who is completely immersed in, and therefore one with Tamaya Ananda, bliss composed only of Tat It, or the infinite and absolute reality, which rose as true self-knowledge, I am I. Having destroyed his finite individual self, what single thing is there to do, or for doing? He does not know any other thing, but only his own real self. Therefore, how to think, or who can think that his state is such and such? The state of true self-knowledge, which is the state of infinite and absolute happiness, is the state of just being, the state in which we have discovered that the infinite thinking consciousness that we called our mind was a mere illusion, that existed only in its own limited and distorted view and is therefore, in reality, entirely non-existent. Since our mind is the original cause, source, and base of all activity, this mind-free state of just being is entirely devoid of even the least activity, action, karma, or doing. Since this state of true self-knowledge is thus utterly devoid of our thinking, doing, and knowing mind, it is also devoid of all knowledge of otherness or duality, because it is therefore a state that completely transcends all thoughts and words. Sri Ramana asked how anyone could possibly conceive it or think of it as it really is. Any conception that we may form in our mind about this state of true self-knowledge is therefore inaccurate, because it is merely an attempt to conceive the inconceivable. Likewise, any words that we may use to describe it are inadequate, because they are merely an attempt to define the indefinable. The state of true self-knowledge can never be known by our finite mind, but can be experienced only by us when our thinking mind is destroyed. In order to experience it, therefore, we must turn our mind inwards and drown it in its own source, which is our true and essential being. Hence, we can never gain true knowledge from mere words or by turning our attention outwards to read word-filled books, but only by turning our attention inwards to read the silent book of our own heart. Words and books can serve a useful purpose only insofar as they point our mind in the right direction in which it must focus its attention in order to be able to experience true knowledge. However, even those few books that direct us to turn our minds selfwards will be truly beneficial to us only if we follow their directions and attempt to make our minds sink with true love and steadfast desirelessness into the deepest core of our own being. Therefore, instead of concentrating our efforts in repeatedly studying a few books that truly convince us and remind us of the need for us to turn our mind inwards, and in sincerely and persistently trying to practice the art of self-attentive being that those books teach us, if we continue reading innumerable books to gather more and more extraneous knowledge, we will be wasting valuable time and distracting our mind from our true purpose, which is to give up all other knowledge and thereby to sink in the only true knowledge, the simple non-dual knowledge or consciousness of our own being, I am. Therefore, in the 16th paragraph of Nanyar, Sri Ramana says, since in every true spiritual treatise it is said that for attaining mukti, spiritual emancipation, liberation, or salvation, it is necessary for us to restrain our mind after knowing that mano nigraha, holding down, holding within, restraining, subduing, suppressing, or destroying our mind, is the ultimate intention or purpose of such treatises, there is no benefit to be gained by studying without limit a countless number of treatises. For restraining our mind, it is necessary for us to investigate ourselves in order to know who we really are. But instead of doing so, how can we know ourselves by investigating in treatises? It is necessary for us to know ourselves only by our own eye of jnana, true knowledge, that is, by our own selfward-turned consciousness. Does a person called Raman need a mirror to know himself as Raman? Our self is within the panchakosas, the 5 sheaths, with which we seem to have covered and obscured our true being, namely our physical body, our prana or life force, our mind, our intellect, and the seeming darkness or ignorance of sleep, whereas treatises are outside them. Therefore, investigating in treatises, hoping to be able thereby to know ourselves, whom we should investigate with an inward-turned attention, having removed, set aside, abandoned, or separated all the panchakosas, is useless or unprofitable. Knowing ayarthata svarupa, our own real self or essential being, having investigated who is our false individual self, who is in bondage, being bound within the imaginary confines of our mind, is mukti, emancipation. The name Atma Vichara is truly applicable only to the practice of always being, abiding, or remaining, having put, placed, kept, seated, deposited, detained, fixed, or established our mind in Atma, our own real self. Whereas dhyana, meditation, is imagining ourself to be Satchitananda Brahman, the absolute reality, which is being consciousness bliss. At one time, it will become necessary for us to forget all that we have learnt.